Welcome everyone to this monument to Victorian optimism. I guess the topic we're discussing this evening isn't one that the Victorians would have had a lot of time for. Have we been conned over climate change? And if so, by who? Seriously though, I think that tonight we can begin to investigate some of the deeper issues around climate change, to investigate where we've gone wrong in our response to climate change and what we can do about it. I'm going to be acting as a participating chair. It's a little bit of an awkward role because I want to give full time to our splendid panellists here. And they represent a mix of skills and experience that I think we couldn't ever hope to better. We have Ross Garnaut, author of the Garnaut Report. We have with us Bill McKibben, and Clive Hamilton. I'm just going to speak very briefly about, in order to conceptualise the discussion that we're having this evening, give a bit of briefing before I hand over the podium to our participants. But before I do that, I should just say the way we're going to run this evening is a brief speech, a 5-minute speech from each of our panellists, followed by a panel discussion, which I'll try to lead, and then hopefully with ample time for questions from the floor. So put your thinking hats on, and I think we'll have plenty of time for a good question and answer discussion. By way of background, I guess if we cast our minds back 6 months ago, we can see that the political landscape around climate change has altered profoundly. Over the last 3 years, I've been acting as chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council, which is a business council put together to try to ensure a good outcome at Copenhagen. And I must say that attending that meeting was an extraordinary experience. It's hard to give you a sense of what it was like to be there. It was huge, messy, utterly chaotic, but it had the feel about it of a festival as well. These meetings to deal with the climate crisis are very different from other meetings that occur to try to deal with other global crises, in that they're very, very public events. In the halls surrounding the meeting rooms, there was an enormous diversity of interest groups and lobby groups, including a group of young Australians who were 39 days through a fast. They hadn't eaten for 39 days. That's how strongly they felt about the issue. And, of course, our expectations of that huge, chaotic process were extraordinarily high. Many people hoped to see a real resolution of the issue, maybe even a global treaty, come out of it. And I'm often asked, was that meeting a failure or a success? I don't think we can judge that yet, but what we can say for sure is that the consequences of that meeting will be with us for a long time and will play out not only in Australian politics but in politics globally. And that's one thread I'd really like to follow through tonight. I do believe, however, that meeting was a significant step forward in many ways, but one in particular. The Copenhagen Accord, which was the only meaningful outcome, really, of the meeting, is now something which is really owned by the developing countries. And I think when we look back on COP15, what we'll see is that meeting was one where the sort of mantle of responsibility, if you want, for the climate issue was spread beyond the developed countries, into the developing countries. Now, the outcome and the level of responsibility that we're carrying may not be as high as many people would like to see, but it is undeniable now that there has been a distinct change. And when you go to places like India, China, Brazil and so forth, you can see that there is a much deeper engagement on this issue than there ever was before. In terms of the outcome of the meeting, I think perhaps we should have been warned by work social scientists had done 2 years prior to the meeting. They had done a simulation, a game theory simulation of the climate meeting, given some students, Danish students, €40 each, divided them into teams of 10 and said, now you've got to cooperate to see if you can save the world's climate. And you've got to cooperate in this way. If each of you puts €20 into a common pot, not only will you save the world's climate, but you'll get to take €20 home. And even under those circumstances where we're dealing with idealistic young people, climate certainty, the certainty of a climatic catastrophe and the possibility that they'll take home €20 each, only half of the 10 teams set up actually managed to save the climate. Tells us a little bit, I think, about the nature of these negotiations and the nature of ourselves as a species. I guess it also forces us to ask whether we have a viable global mechanism. Having said that, I'd like to call on Ross Garnaut as our first speaker. He's an economist with an illustrious record in public policy. He's a chairman of public companies, advisor to prime ministers, ambassador to China, and of course author of the Garnaut Report. His latest book is The Great Crash of 2008, and I'd like to ask him, when he speaks, to focus on those issues of where we've gone wrong and what we can do about it.
Thanks, Tim. I think Tim set the right context in saying that it's too soon to tell whether Copenhagen was a failure. It was certainly a fiasco. But the meeting itself and the failure of the meeting to bring together a treaty wasn't the only thing going on. In preparation for Copenhagen, a lot of countries started to look more seriously at the climate change issue, and a number of countries have used the aftermath of Copenhagen, signing on to the Copenhagen Accord, which I call the Obama Accord, to solidify a stronger focus on climate change policy. The early discussions, the early international discussions, I think were all built on a false premise, and that was that the developed countries could take the first steps and that there was time for developing countries to do things much later, after the developed countries had done what they'd promised, because we did all promise to take certain big steps in reducing emissions. But by the early 21st century, it was too late for that. There was going to be no solution, no avoidance of high risks of dangerous climate change unless the big developing countries also reduced the trajectory of their emissions growth from business as usual. But the paradigm that we were working in was one in which we had all agreed that the developing countries did not need to do anything until the developed countries had shown the way and taken certain steps. And I had thought that this flaw in the Rio, the Kyoto, the Bali agreements would turn out to be a great difficulty. There's a few chapters in my climate change review that are about the international situation, and in those chapters I developed, on the basis of some principles that have been part of the international discussion, a proportionate allocation of effort across countries. And this required, rather radically at the time, the big developing countries, especially China, to start doing something. Well, when we look across the world now and look at the commitments that countries have made as a result of the Copenhagen Accord, we find that the developing countries as a whole have made commitments more or less in line. What my calculations showed was necessary if we were going to get a strong international agreement to stabilise emissions at around 450 parts per million. That's especially because China is doing a lot more than I thought was possible, and a lot more than was required in my calculations of proportionate effort. There's been a dramatic change in the last couple of years of the priority of this issue within China. The commitment that China made to reduce emissions by 40 to 45% as a proportion of GDP, as a share of GDP by 2020, were thought by the economic advisors to the Chinese government to be impossible, and they advised against it because they thought it was impossible and China would just look silly. The Chinese leadership said, no, we're going to do that, and you're going to find a way in which we can achieve that outcome. And they are busy achieving that outcome now. The governors of every province have been told to deliver on a 40 to 45% reduction in the emissions intensity of GDP by 2020, and they've been told that if they don't do the job, they'll be pushed aside and the central government will come in and close down emissions-intensive activities until they've reached the target. Alongside that, there's huge efforts to reduce the energy intensity of the economy, huge efforts into developing solar, wind power, biomass, and nuclear sources of energy, and the combination of these are increasing their share of the energy mix in China much more quickly than anticipated, and there is serious discussion within the main policy agencies of setting a year for peaking in coal combustion and after that year bringing things down. Now, the growth of the Chinese economy is so strong that all of those things won't stop emissions rising for some time, but they're rising at a much lower level than the lowest level that I thought was possible. If you look at Indonesia, there's also been a very important improvement in the focus. You can say the same of Brazil and South Africa. Not quite so strong in India, but the developing country story is a surprisingly good one. So we can't say the world as a whole is not taking any steps. The big disappointments for the world as a whole are the countries that are the biggest emitters in the world, the three developed countries that have the highest per capita emitters of any, the United States, Canada and Australia. And of the three, the biggest disappointment is Australia, where we're doing almost nothing. Our resource industries are actually getting a free kick because other countries are doing a lot, so the price of natural gas is higher in world markets than it otherwise would be because Japan, Taiwan, Korea, China are taking environmental issues seriously. China's closing down high emissions, environmentally damaging and unsafe small coal mines, and that's creating part of the big growth in demand for Australian coal at the moment. So why have we become the laggard when we're conspicuous as the country in the world with the biggest per capita emissions, and we're conspicuous because of all the developed countries? We are the country that has the strongest national interest in strong mitigation because we will be hurt earlier and harder by unmitigated climate change than any other country. My review demonstrated that. Why has this happened? Well, I think that an important part of the story is that Australia in the early 21st century has seen a reversion of the political culture to the political culture that dominated Australia for the first 8 decades of our federation, where vested interests dominate the political process. We don't have a very strong role for an independent centre of the policy-making process. This is going on in all developed countries. It's part of the crisis of Europe. It's part of the crisis of the United States. And I addressed this question in the Great Crash, and I'll just conclude by reading a few paragraphs from my book, The Great Crash. The haunting question raised by the financial crisis is whether a United States government that is committed to effective action that damages some corporate interests is free to pursue policies that it judges to be in the national interest. The experience of the European Union and Australia on climate change policy is not reassuring. Powerful vested interests are resisting the policy reform necessary to tackle climate change, just as they resisted financial regulation policy. Will the interaction of distorted incentive structures and regulatory capture be as damaging for climate change policy as it was for financial policy? Perhaps, but political communities in all countries are much more deeply engaged with climate change than they were with financial regulation. This creates an opportunity for autonomy for any government that seeks to use it. In financial policy, the future of democratic capitalism will hinge on the capacity of governments to act independently of vested interests. With climate change, the future of human civilization is probably at stake. Thanks.
Thank you, Ross. It's now my privilege to introduce Bill McKibben. He is the author of the first book to be written about climate change and its threat. Back in, was it 1989? I think you published The End of Nature, Bill? Yeah. He also has been an extraordinarily active person in the climate field. He's the founder of Step It Up, an organisation trying to a grassroots organisation urging action for climate change, and of course 350.org, which we've heard a lot about over the last year. He's also an active member of his local Methodist church, and his latest book, now I've got to try to pronounce this, Bill, is it, I can't quite get the burp right, Earth, is it? E-A-A-R-T-H, is, I think, a must-read. Bill, how do you see the current situation, particularly in the US, in terms of the climate issue?
Thank you, Tim, and what a pleasure to be here. I know that we're supposed to be in a very angry mood tonight and worried about being conned and fearful and all of that, and I'm perfectly willing to participate in any Olympics of dread, that we can come up with, but I've got to confess, my main feeling as I stand up here, in a sense, is gratitude. First and foremost, for the fact that there are now so many other people, and especially other writers, engaged in this work. When I wrote The End of Nature 21 years ago, it wasn't just the first book about climate. There really wasn't another one for a decade after. And I remember thinking to myself, am I crazy? Isn't this the most important thing in the world, and why aren't we getting to it? And it was with enormous relief that I, watched as other people began finally to take this up, none of them more cogently than Tim Flannery, and whose work has been an enormous, enormous help. I'm also very, very grateful, and one of the reasons I wanted to come to Australia, I'm very, very grateful for the movement that we've seen rise up around the world finally in the last year, the first really global grassroots movement about climate, this 350.org campaign that maybe I'll describe more later in a little bit. But last October 24th, when we had this first day of action, we managed to, somewhat to our own amazement, organize on one day 5,200 rallies and demonstrations in 181 countries all around this kind of obscure scientific data point, 350 parts per million CO2, that the scientists told us was the most we could safely have. 240 of those events were in Australia, including, and because of Australia's chronological precedence on this planet, some very important ones that provided us pictures early in the day that we then spread around the globe and were very important. This turned out to be, at least according to CNN, the most widespread day of political action on any issue at any time in the planet's history. And Australia played an enormous part in making that happen, and for that I'm extraordinarily grateful. That's the good news. That's all the good news, I'm afraid. Look, 20 years on, the science is way darker even than we thought back then. The only thing we didn't know 20 years ago was how quickly climate change would break over our heads, and the answer is much more quickly than we anticipated. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree. We wouldn't have guessed that that would be enough to cause really huge change, but it turns out the planet was very finely balanced. Hence, everything frozen on Earth is now busily melting. Hence, the oceans are now 30% more acid as they try to absorb all that carbon from the atmosphere. Hence, we're seeing the incredible disruptions of the hydrological cycles of the planet. The chief fact of the 21st century may well turn out to be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. You've begun to see in Australia what those alternations of drought and downpour look like and feel like. That's happening around the planet with enormous effect. We have lost the Earth that we knew. The 10,000 years of remarkable stability that marked the Holocene and saw the rise of human civilization is over. That's why I called this book with that odd extra A in the title. And in fact, the way to pronounce it's more you have to it's kind of Schwarzenegger. You sort of, Earth, is the, we're not going to get back that planet. And we're not, in fact, at least anytime soon, going to get back to 350. We've blown past that and we're headed for much, much higher amounts of carbon in the atmosphere. The question now on offer is not can we stop global warming, is can we stop global warming short of an all-out civilization scale challenge? And the answer to that is not at all clear. If we're not able to quickly transition off fossil fuel, then the climatologists are quite clear that we're going to see a rise not of 1 degree, but of 5, 6, 7 degrees in the course of this century. And I think there's very little chance that we'll be able to deal with that in any coherent way. So the challenge is to do things right now to try to turn that around. We've built a new Earth. We have to live on that new Earth. We have to do it gracefully and lightly. Most of all, we have to do it together. And that was, for me, the great pleasure of this event last year in October, which we'll repeat in a different way, and I'll talk about it later on the 10th of October this year. Those pictures flowing in from all over the world showed that the old idea that environmentalism was something for rich white people to do once they'd taken care of their other problems was incorrect. There are 25,000 pictures of those events on the Flickr account at 350.org, and what they show is that most of the people who participated were poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. And what do you know? They're just as concerned about the future as anybody else. That was very good news. In a world that is in desperate need of some good news, we hope we can continue to build that momentum and make it count. So thank you all very much who helped last year, and thank you all in advance for helping in the future as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Bill. Clive Hamilton is one of this country's leading thinkers. He's the author of best-selling books such as Growth Fetish, and he's Charles Sturt Professor of Public Ethics at Australian National University. His latest book is titled Requiem for a Species. It's a fantastic book in my view, but it's pretty pessimistic. I'm really looking forward to seeing how Clive came to that particular conclusion. Thank you, Clive.
At some point, finally, the full truth of what the climate scientists are saying breaks through all of our defences. We can no longer pretend that the impacts of warming are too far off to worry about, or that the scientists must be exaggerating. At some point, we realise that our apathy is rooted in fear, or that our hopes for a political upheaval are probably no more than wishful thinking. We concede that no technological marvel can arrive in time, and the most insidious barrier of them all can no longer protect us, and that's the wall that separates intellectual acceptance of global warming from the true emotional meaning of a hot world. It's the handy device that allows us to declare, yes, of course, I'm one of those that understands what's coming. I've known it for a long time, while all the time shutting off the horror of a world at 4, 5 or 6 degrees of warming, a world in which progress ends and human survival is in doubt. For some, the realisation is a creeping one as the true meaning of warming leaks into our consciousness. For others, the breakthrough is sudden and overwhelming. It's been called the oh shit moment. The instant when your whole world shifts and nothing is the same thereafter. A few have described their own trigger for the oh shit moment. For example, reading about the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, or hearing James Hansen say that we have 10 years to act and knowing it's not going to happen. Realising that China's coal-dependent growth is unstoppable. Or watching leaders proclaim their bold commitment, then backpedal as soon as the going gets tough. My own moment came in September 2008 when I read an analysis by two climate scientists, Kevin Anderson and Alice Bose from the Tyndall Centre. With relentless logic, they set out the world's carbon abatement task before reaching a shattering conclusion. They begin by making some optimistic assumptions about how the world might cut its greenhouse gas emissions. Let's say global emissions reach a peak in 2020, a prospect faint before the Copenhagen conference and perhaps fanciful now. Nevertheless, let's clutch at this and then assume that after 2020, rich countries cut their emissions at a rate of 6% per year for some decades. That's a rate of reduction equalled only by Russia in the 1990s, a time when their GDP was cut in half. But we'll clutch at that too. So with these heroic assumptions for how the world could reduce emissions, where would that leave us? Well, forget 450 parts per million, or 2 degrees of warming. Forget 550 parts per million, or 3 degrees of warming. This optimistic scenario would see the world warm by 4 degrees this century. That's an awful calculus. With 4 degrees of warming, the Earth will be hotter than at any time for the last 15 million years. It'll be an era of extreme weather events, with most sea species at serious risk. We'll pass most of the tipping points identified by climate scientists: loss of the Arctic summer sea ice, melting of the Himalayan Tibetan glaciers, melting of the Greenland ice sheets, loss of the Amazon rainforest, disruption to El Niño, and more. The climate will be radically transformed and no longer subject to our influence. It will be beyond our control. Before I read the Anderson and Bose paper, and others since which have confirmed it, I knew we were in trouble. I knew that the Bali call for rich countries to cut their emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020 was scientifically necessary, but politically almost inconceivable. But I hoped for some great awakening that would prove it could be done, that our leaders would suddenly recognise how dire the situation is, or that the people would take to the streets to force their governments to act. But the truth, the horrible truth, is that we've left it too late. Any clear-eyed look at the numbers will destroy our mushy hopes that we can avoid serious disruption to the climate system. If the top world leaders all had an epiphany and decided to force through against ferocious resistance an economic transformation matched only in wartime, and did so in the next 10 years, then in all likelihood we would still reach some 4 degrees of warming.